Well, good evening. Tonight I was going to begin a novel by Josephine Tay entitled Brat Farah, and it is one of my very favorites. However, given the state of the news at home and abroad, I think tonight we need to go a little lighter. So I will turn, as usual, for light and fun readings to P.G. Wodehouse. That's Pelham Grenville Wodehouse. And this one is called Tried in the Furnace. So next week, we start the novel. Tonight, we just relax and enjoy. I hope we'll, anyway. Tried in the Furnace. The Drones Club had just come to an end, and it was the unanimous verdict of the little group assembled in the bar for a last quick one that the gem of the evening had been item number 6 on the program, the Knockabout Crosstalk Act of Cyril Barmy, Fotheringay Phipps, and Reginald Pongo, Twistleton. Both Cyril in the red beard and Reginald in the more effective green whiskers, very peak of their form. With sparkling repartee and vigorous byplay, they had gripped the audience from the start. In fact, said an egg, it struck me that they were even better than last year. Their act seemed to have deepened somehow. A thoughtful crumpet nodded. I noticed the same thing. The fact is, they passed through a soul-testing experience not long ago, and it has left its mark upon them. It also nearly wrecked the act. I don't know if any of you fellows are aware of it, but at one time they had definitely decided to scratch the fixture and not give a performance at all. What? Absolute toucher of failing to keep faith with their public. Bad blood had sprung up between them. Also pique and strained relations. They were not on speaking terms. His hearers were frankly incredulous. They pointed out that the friendship between the two artistes had always been a byword, or whatever you called it. A well-read egg summed it up by saying they were like thingaming, and what's his name? Nevertheless, insisted the crumpet, what I am telling you is straight official stuff. 2 weeks ago, if Barmy had said to Pongo, "Who was that lady I saw you coming from?" replied, "That was no lady, that was my wife," he would simply have raised his eyebrows coldly and turned away in a marked manner. It was the woman, of course, proceeded the crumpet, who came between them. Angelica Briscoe was her name, and she was the daughter of the Reverend P.P. Briscoe, who vetted the souls of the local peasantry at a place called Maiden Eggsford, down in Somersetshire. This hamlet is about half a dozen miles from the well-known resort, Ridmouth-on-Sea, and it was in the establishment of the Messrs. Thorpe and Widgery, the popular grocers of that town, that Barmy and Pongo first set eyes on the girl. I should golf, but principally to be alone and away from distractions, so that they would be able to concentrate on the rehearsing and building up of this crosstalk act, which we have just witnessed. And on the morning of which I speak, they had strolled into the Thorpe and Widgery Emporium to lay in a few little odds and ends, and there, putting in a bid for 5 pounds of streaky bacon, was a girl so lovely that they congealed in their tracks. And as they stood staring, she said to the bloke behind the counter, "That's the lot. Send them to Miss Angelica Briscoe, the vicarage, Maiden Eggsford." She then pushed off, and Barmy and Pongo, feeling rather as if they had been struck by lightning, bought some sardines and a segment sort of way, and went out. They were both pretty quiet for the rest of the day. And after dinner that night, Pongo said to Barmy, "I say, Barmy." And Barmy said, "Hello." And And Pongo said, "I say, Barmy, it's a bally nuisance, but I'll have to buzz up to London for a day or two. I've suddenly remembered some spots of business that call for my personal attention. You won't mind my leaving you?" Barmy could scarcely conceal his brazeness. Within 2 minutes of seeing that girl, he had made up his mind that somehow or other he must repair to Maiden Exford and get to know her. And the problem which had been vexing him all day had been what to do with the body, viz. Pongo's. "Not a bit," he says, "I can." "Don't hurry," said Barmy heartily. "As a matter of fact, a few days' lay-off will do the act all the good in the world. Any pro will tell you that the worst thing possible is to over-rehearse. Stay away as long as you like." So next morning, it was a Saturday, Pongo climbed onto a train, and in the afternoon, Barmy collected his baggage and pushed off to the Goose and Grasshopper at Maiden Exford. And having booked a room there and toppled into the saloon bar for a refresher with the love light in his eyes, chatting across the counter with the barmaid. Neither was much bucked. A touch of constraint about sums it up. "Hello," said Barmy. "Hello," said Pongo. "You here?" "Yes." "You here?" "Yes." "Oh." There was a bit of silence. "So you didn't go to London," said Barmy. "No," said Pongo. "Oh," said Barmy. "And you didn't stick on at Widmouth," said Pongo. "No," said Barmy. "Oh," said Pongo. There was some more silence. "You came here, I see," said Pongo. "I see you came here." "Yes," said Pongo. "An odd coincidence." "Very odd." "Well, skin off your nose," said Pongo. "Fluff in your latchkey," said Barmy. He drained his glass and tried to exhibit a light-hearted nonchalance, but his mood was somber. He was a chap who could put two and two together and sift and weigh the evidence and all that sort of thing. And it was plain to him that love had brought Pongo also to this hamlet. Indeed, it was at this instant, he tells me, that there came to him the first nebulous idea of oiling out of that crosstalk of theirs. He thought of having to ask a beastly, butting-in blighter like Reginald Twistleton if he was fond of mutton broth, and being compelled to hit him over the head with a rolled-up umbrella when he replied, "No, Mutton Jeff." It somehow seemed to revolt his finest feelings. Conversation rather languished after this, and presently Pongo excused himself in a somewhat stiff manner and went upstairs to his room, listening in a distressed kind of way to the barmaid telling him what cucumber did to her digestive organs, that a fellow in +4s entered the bar, and Barmy saw that he was wearing the tie of his old school. Well, you know how it is when you're in some public spot and a stranger comes in wearing the old school tie. You shove a hasty hand over your own and start to sidle out before the chap. And Barmy was just doing this when the barmaid uttered these sensational words, "Good evening, Mr. Briscoe." Barmy stood spellbound. He turned to the barmaid and spoke in a hushed whisper. "Did you say Briscoe?" "Yes, sir." "From the vicarage?" "Yes, sir." Barmy quivered like a jelly. The thought that he had had the amazing luck to find in the brother of the girl he loved an old schoolmate made him feel boneless. After all, he felt, as he took his hand away, like that of the old school. If you meet one of the dear old school in a public spot, he meant to say, why, you go straight up to him and start fraternizing. He made a beeline for the chap's table. I say, he said, I see you are wearing a... The chap's hand had shot up to his tie with a sort of nervous gesture, but he evidently realized that the time had gone by for his protective measures. He smiled, a bit wryly. Have a drink, he said. I've got one, thanks, said Barmy. I'll bring it along to your table, shall I? So please, what? Oh, rather. I think I'd have been a bit after your time, wouldn't I? Said Barmy, for the fellow was well stricken in years. 28, if a day. Fotheringay Phipps is more or less my name. Yours is Briscoe, what? Yes. Barmy swallowed a couple of times. Yesterday in Widmouth, he said, blushing prettily. So scarlet indeed did his countenance become that the other regarded him narrowly, and Barmy knew that he had guessed his secret. You saw her in Widmouth yesterday, eh? Yes. And now you're here. Yes. Well, well, said the chap, drawing his breath in rather thoughtfully. There was a pause, during which Barmy's vascular motors continued to do their bit. You must meet her, said the chap. I should like to, said Barmy. I only saw her for a moment, buying streaky bacon, but she seemed a charming girl. Oh, she is. But rather attractive, she struck me as. Quite. I gave her the merest glance, you understand, but I should say at a venture that she has a great white soul. In fact, said Barmy, losing his grip altogether, you wouldn't be far out in describing her as divine. You must certainly meet her, said the chap. Then he shook his head. No, it wouldn't be any good. Why not? Pleaded Barmy. Well, I'll tell you, said the chap. You know what girls are. They have their little enthusiasms, and it hurts them. Parson's daughter, Angelica, is wrapped up at present in the annual village school treat. I can see at a glance the sort of fellow you are. Witty, mordant, ironical. You would get off one of your devastating epigrams at the expense of the school treat, and while she might laugh at the wit, she would be deeply wounded by the satire. But I wouldn't dream. But if you didn't, if you spoke approvingly of the school treat, what then? The next thing that would happen would be that she would be asking you to help her run it, and that would bore you stiff. Barmy shook from stem to stern. This was better even than he had hoped. Help her with the school treat? Why, you wouldn't do it, would you? I should enjoy it above all things. Well, if that's the way you feel, the matter can easily be arranged. She will be here any moment now to pick me up in her car. And sure enough, not 2 minutes later, there floated through the open window a silvery voice, urging the fellow, who seemed to answer to the name of Fathead, to come out quick, because the voice did not intend to remain there all night. So the fellow took Barmy out, and there was the girl, sitting in a two-seater. He introduced Barmy. The girl beamed. Barmy beamed. The fellow said that Barmy was anxious to come and help with the school treat. Barmy beamed again, and presently the car drove off, the girl's last words being a reminder that the binge started at 2 sharp on the Monday. That night, as they dined together, Barmy and Pongo put in their usual spot of rehearsing. It was their practice to mold and shape the act during meals, as they found that mastication seemed to sharpen their intellect. But tonight, it would have been plain to an observant spectator that their hearts were not in it. There was an unmistakable coolness between them. Pongo said that he had an aunt who complained of rheumatism, and Barmy said, well, who wouldn't? And Pongo said, Did he want to? But the old fire and sparkle was absent, and they had relaxed into a moody silence when the door opened and the barmaid pushed her head in. "Miss Briscoe has just sent over a message, Mr. Phipps," said the barmaid. "She said she would like you to be there a little earlier than 2, if you can manage it. 1:15, if possible, because there's always so much to do." "Oh, right," said Barney, a bit rattled, for he had heard the sharp breath. "I'll tell her," said the barmaid. She withdrew, and Barney found Pongo's eyes resting on him like a couple of blobs of vitriol. "What's all this?" asked Pongo. Barney tried to be airy. "Oh, it's nothing. Just the local school treat. The vicar's daughter here, Miss Briscoe, seems anxious that I should drop round on Monday and help her run it." Pongo started to grind his teeth, but he had a chunk of potato in his mouth at the moment and was hampered. But he gripped the table till his knuckles stood out white under the strain. "Have you been sneaking round behind my back on Miss Briscoe?" he demanded. "I do not like your tone, Reginald." "Never mind about my tone. I'll attend to my tone. Of all the bally-low hounds that ever stepped, you are the lowest. So this is what the friendship of years amounts to, is it? You crawl in here and try to cut me out with the girl I love. Well, dash it, that is quite enough. But dash it, I wish to hear no more. But dash it, I love her too. It's not my fault if you happen to love her too, is it? I mean to say, if a fellow loves a girl and another fellow loves her too, you can't expect the fellow who loves the girl to edge out because he happens to be acquainted with the fellow who loves her too. When it comes up for his own interests, hasn't he? You didn't find Romeo or any of those chaps easing away from the girl just to oblige a pal, did you? Certainly not. So I don't see—" "Please," said Pongo. A silence fell. "Might I trouble you to pass the mustard, Fotheringay Phipps?" said Pongo coldly. "Certainly, Twistleton," replied Barney, with equal hauteur. It is always unpleasant not to be on speaking terms with an old friend. To be cooped up alone in a man with whom one has ceased to converse is simply rotten. And this is especially so if the day happens to be a Sunday. Maiden Eggsford, like so many of our rural hamlets, is not at its best and brightest on a Sunday. When you have walked down the main street and looked at the Jubilee watering trough, there is nothing much to do except go home, down the main street once more, and take another look at the Jubilee watering trough. It will give you some rough idea of the state to which balmy Fotheringay Phipps had been reduced by the end of the next day, when I tell you that the sound of the church bells ringing for evensong brought him out of the Goose and Grasshopper as if he had heard a fire engine. The thought that at last something was going to happen in Maiden Eggswood in which the Jubilee watering trough motif was not stressed stirred him strangely. He was in his pew in 3 jumps, and as the service got underway, he began to feel curious emotions going on in his bosom. There is something about evening church in a village in the summertime that they had left the door open, and through it came the scent of lime trees and wallflowers and the distant hum of bees fooling about. And gradually there poured over Barmy a wave of sentiment. As he sat and listened to the first lesson, he became a changed man. The lesson was one of those chapters of the Old Testament all about how Abimelech begat Jazbo and Jazbo begat Zechariah, and what with the beauty of the woods and the words and the peace of his surroundings, Barmy suddenly began to become... He had not done the square thing, he told himself, by dear old Pongo. Here was a chap, notoriously one of the best, as sound an egg as ever donned a heliotrope sock, and he was deliberately chiseling him out of the girl he loved. He was doing the dirty on a fellow whom he had been pally with since their Eton jacket days, a bloke who time and again had shared with him his last bar of Almond Rock. Was this right? Was this just? Would a bit, or for that matter, a fat jazz boat to Zachariah? The answer, he could not disguise it from himself, was in the negative. It was a different, stronger Barmy, a changed, chastened Cyril Fotheringay Phipps, who left the sacred edifice at the conclusion of the vicar's 50-minute sermon. He had made the great decision. It would play the Dickens with his heart and probably render the rest of his life a blank, but nevertheless he would retire from the unseemly struggle and give the girl up to Pongo. As they called supper together, Barmy cleared his throat and looked across at Pongo with a sad, sweet smile. "Pongo," he said. The other glanced distantly up from his baked potato. "There is something you wish to say to me, Fotheringay Phipps?" "Yes," said Barmy. "A short while ago, I sent a note to Miss Briscoe, informing her that I shall not be attending the school treat, and mentioning that you will be there in my stead. Take her, Pongo, old man. She is yours. I scratch my nomination." Pongo stared. His whole manner changed. It was as if he had been a Trappist monk who had suddenly decided to give Trappism a miss and become one of the boys again. "But dash it, this is noble." No, but it is. It's, well, dash it, I hardly know what to say. I hope you will be very, very happy. Thanks, old man. Very, very, very happy. Rather, I should say so. And I'll tell you one thing. In the years to come, there will always be a knife and fork for you at our little home. The children shall be taught to call you Uncle Barmy. "Thanks," said Barmy. "Thanks." "Oh." At this moment, the barmaid entered with a note for Barmy. He read it and crumpled it up. "From her?" asked Pongo. "Yes." "Saying she quite understands, and so forth?" "Yes." Pongo ate a piece of cheese in a meditative manner. He seemed to be pursuing some train of thought. "I should think," he said, "that a fellow who married a clergyman's daughter would get the ceremony performed at, probably, if not absolutely on the nod. I shouldn't wonder." "Not," said Pongo, "that I am influenced by any consideration like that, of course. My love is pure and flame-like, with no taint of dross. Still, in times like these, every little bit helps." "Quite," said Barmy, "quite." He found it hard to control his voice. He had lied to his friend about that note. What Angelica Briscoe had really said in it was that it was quite all right if he wanted to edge out of the school treat, but that she would require him to take the village mothers for their annual outing on the same day. There had to be some responsible person with them, and the curate had sprained his ankle. Barmy could read between the lines. He saw what this meant. His fatal fascination had done its deadly work, and the girl had become infatuated with him. No other explanation would fit the facts. It was absurd to suppose that she would lightly have elected him for this extraordinarily important assignment. Obviously, it was the big event of the village year. Anyone would do to mess about at the school treat, but Angelica Briscoe would place in only a man she trusted, respected, loved. He sighed. What must be, he felt, must be. He had done his conscientious best to retire in favor of his friend, but fate had been too strong. I find it a little difficult, said the trumpet. I found it a little difficult to elicit from Barmy exactly what occurred at the annual outing of the village mothers of Maiden Eggsford. When telling me the story, he had the air of a man whose old wound is troubling him. It was not indeed till the fourth cocktail that he really became communicative. And then, speaking with a kind of stony look in his eye, he gave me a fairly comprehend. Each word seemed to hurt him in some tender spot. The proceedings would appear to have been opened in a quiet and orderly manner. 16 females of advanced years assembled in a motor coach, and the expedition was seen off from the vicarage door by the Reverend P.P. Briscoe in person. Under his eye, Barmy tells me, the beauty chorus was demure and docile. It was a treat to listen to their murmured responses. As nice and respectable a bunch of mothers, Barmy says, as he had ever struck. His only apprehension at this point, he tells me, would possibly be a trifle stodgy. He feared a touch of ennui. He needn't have worried. There was no ennui. The human cargo, as I say, had started out in a spirit of demureness and docility. But it was amazing what a difference a mere 50 yards of the high road made to these mothers. No sooner were they out of sight of the vicarage than they began to effervesce to an almost unbelievable extent. The first intimation Barmy had, other than those which he had anticipated, was when a very stout mother in a pink bonnet and a dress covered with bugles suddenly picked off a passing cyclist with a well-directed tomato, causing him to skid into a ditch, upon which all 16 mothers laughed like fiends in hell, and it was plain that they considered that the proceedings had now been formally opened. Of course, looking back at it now in a calmer spirit, Barmy tells me that he can realize that there is much to be said in palliation of the exuberance of these ghastly female pimples. When you are shut up all the year round in a place like Maiden Eggsford, with nothing to do but wash underclothing and attend divine service, you're naturally inclined to let yourself go a bit at times of festival and holidays. And his spiritual agony was pretty pronounced. If there's one thing Barmy hates, it's being conspicuous. And conspicuous is precisely what a fellow cannot fail to be when he's in a motor coach with 16 women of mature ages who alternate between singing ribald songs and hurling volleys of homely chaff at passers-by. In this connection, he tells me, he was thinking of a Homburg hat, which he had pinched from the driver of the vehicle, whose prose style appeared to have been modeled on that of Rabelais. It was a more than usually penetrating sally on the part of this female, which at length led him to venture a protest. I say, dash it. You know what, I mean, dash it. I hope that the rebuke had not been phrased as nearly as he would have wished. Still, lame though it had been, it caused a sensation which can only be described as profound. Mother looked at mother. Eyebrows were raised. Breath drawn in censoriously. "Young man," said the mother in the pink bonnet, who seemed to have elected herself forewoman, "kindly keep your remarks to yourself." Another mother said, "The idea," and a third described it as, "Of your impudence," said the one in the pink bonnet. "Ah," agreed the others. "A slip of a boy like that," said the mother in the Homburg hat, and there was a general laugh, as if the meeting considered that the point had been well taken. Barmy subsided. He was wishing that he had yielded to the advice of his family and become a curate after coming down from the university. Curates are specially trained to handle this sort of situation. A tough, hard-boiled curate, spitting out of the corner of his mouth, would soon have subdued these mothers, he reflected. He would have played on them as on a stringed instrument, or rather as on... But Barmy, never having taken orders, was helpless. So helpless indeed that when he suddenly discovered that they were heading for Bridmouth-on-Sea, he felt there was nothing he could do about it. From the vicar's own lips, he had had it officially that the program was that the expedition should drive to the neighboring village of Botsford Mortimer, where there were ruins of an old abbey, replete with interest, lunch among these ruins, visit the local village by the late Sir Wansbury Potter, J.P., and after filling with a bit of knitting, return home. And now the whole trend of the party appeared to be toward the amusement park on the Bridmouth Pier. And though Barmy's whole soul shuddered at the thought of these 16 bacchantes let loose in an amusement park, he hadn't the nerve to say a word. It was at about this point, he tells me, that a vision rose before him of Pongo happily loafing through the summer afternoon amidst the placid joys of the school treat. Of what happened at the amusement park, Barmy asked me. He said that even now he could not bear to let his memory dwell upon it. He confessed himself perplexed by the psychology of the thing. These mothers, he said, must have had mothers of their own, and at their mothers' knees must have learned years ago the difference between right and wrong, and yet, well, what he was thinking of particularly, he said, was what had occurred on the Bump the Bumps apparatus. I don't specify exactly, but he said that there was one woman in a puce mantle who definitely seemed to be living for pleasure alone. It was a little unpleasantness with the proprietor of this concern that eventually led to the expedition leaving the amusement park and going down to the beach. Some purely technical point of finance, I understand. He claiming that a mother in Bombazine had had 11 rides and only paid once, lugged into the brawl and rather roughly handled, which was particularly unfortunate because the Bombazine mother explained on the way down to the beach that the whole thing had been due to a misunderstanding. In actual fact, what had really happened was that she had had 12 rides and paid twice. However, he was so glad to get his little troop out of the place that he counted an eye well blacked as the price of deliverance. And his spirits, he tells me, had definitely risen when suddenly the 16 mothers gave a simultaneous whoop and made for a sailing boat along with them. And the next moment they were off across the bay, bowling along before a nippy breeze, which, naturally, cheesed it abruptly as soon as it had landed them far enough away from shore to make things interesting for the unfortunate blighter who had to take to the oars. This, of course, was poor old Barmy. There was a man in charge of the boat, but he, though a rough, untutored salt, had enough sense not to let himself in for a job like rowing this Noah's Ark home. Barmy did put it up to him tentatively, but the fellow said that he had to attend, that he, Barmy, knew how to steer. The fellow said that he, the fellow, could not entrust a valuable boat to an amateur. After which he lit his pipe and lolled back in the stern sheets, with rather the air of an ancient Roman banqueter, making himself cozy among the cushions. and Barmy, attaching himself to a couple of oars of about the size of those served out to galley slaves in the old trireme days, started to put his back into it. For a chap who hadn't rowed anything except a light canoe since he was up at Oxford, he considers he did dash well, especially when you take into account the fact that he was much hampered by the mothers. They would insist on singing that thing about give yourself a pat on the back, and apart from the fact that Barmy considered would have been far more fitting, it was a tune it was pretty hard to keep time to. 7 times he caught crabs, and 7 times those 16 mothers stopped singing and guffawed like one mother. All in all, a most painful experience. Add the fact that the first thing the females did on hitting the old homeland again was to get up an informal dance on the sands, and that the ride home in the quiet even fall was more or less a repetition of the journey out, as he eventually tottered into the saloon bar of the Goose and Grasshopper, had earned the frothing tankard which he now proceeded to order. He had just sucked it down and was signaling for another when the door of the saloon bar opened and in came Pongo. If Barmy had been less preoccupied with his own troubles, he would have seen that Pongo was in poorest shape. His collar was torn, his hair disheveled. There were streaks of chocolate down his face, and half a jam sandwich. And so moved was he at seeing Barmy that he started ticking him off before he had so much as ordered a gin and ginger. "A nice thing you let me in for," said Pongo. "A jolly job you've shoved off on me." Barmy was feeling a little better after his ingurgitations, and he was able to speak. "What are you talking about?" "I am talking about the school treats," replied Pongo with an intense bitterness. "I am talking about sticky hands, who rubbed those hands on me. I am talking—" "Oh, it's no use your gaping like a diseased fish, Fotheringay Phillips. You know dashed well that you planned the whole thing. Your cunning fiend's brain formulated the entire devilish scheme. You engineered the bally outrage for your own foul purposes to queer me with Angelica. You thought that when a girl sees rolled up newspapers by smelly children, she can never feel the same to him again." "Ha!" said Pongo, at last ordering his gin and ginger. Barmy was stunned, of course, by this violent attack, but he retained enough of the nice sense of propriety of the Fotheringay Phippses to realize that this discussion could not be continued in public. Already the barmaid's ears ate him up. "I don't know what the dickens you're talking about," he said, "but bring your drink up to my room, and we'll go into this matter there. We can hardly bandy a woman's name in a saloon bar." "Who's bandying a woman's name?" "You are. You bandied it only a second ago. If you don't call what you said bandying, there are finer-minded men who do." So they went upstairs, and Barmy shut the door. "Now then," he said, "what's all this drivel?" "I've told you." "Tell me again." "I will." "Righto. One moment." Barmy went to the door and opened it sharply, the barmaid falling downstairs. He closed the door again. "Now then," he said. Pongo drained his gin and ginger. "Of all the dirty tricks one man ever played on another," he began, "your sneaking out of that school treat and letting me in for it is one which the verdict of history will undoubtedly rank as the dirtiest. I can read you now like a book, so clear to me. You knew at what a disadvantage a man appears at a school treat, and you saw to it that I, and not you, should be the poor mutt to get smeared with chocolate and sloshed with newspapers before the eyes of Angelica Briscoe. And I believed you, when you handed me all that drip about yielding your claim and whatnot. My gosh! For an instant, as he heard these words, stupefaction rendered Barmy speechless. Then he found his tongue. His generous soul was seething with indignation at the thought of how his altruism, his great sacrifice, had been misinterpreted. "What absolute rot!" he cried. "I never heard such bilge in my life. My motives were unmixedly chivalrous. I did it simply and solely to enable you to ingratiate yourself with the girl, and not reflecting that it was out of the question that she should ever love a pop-eyed, pimply-faced poop like you." Pongo started. Popeye? Popeye was what I said. Pimply-faced? Pimply-faced was the term I employed. Poop? Poop was the expression to know the real obstacle in the way of any wooing you may do now or in the years to come, Twistleton, Twistleton. It is this, that you entirely lack sex appeal and look like nothing on earth. A girl of the sweet, sensitive nature of Angelica Briscoe does not have to see you smeared with chocolate to recoil from you with loathing. She does it automatically, and she does it on her head. Is that so? That is so. Oh, well, let me inform you that in spite of what has happened, my worst, there is something within me that tells me that Angelica Briscoe loves me and will one day be mine. Mine, you mean? I can read the message in a girl's shy, drooping eyes, Twistleton, Twistleton, and I am prepared to give you odds of 11-4 that before the year is out, I shall be walking down the aisle with Angelica Fothergate Phipps on my arm. I will go further, 33-8. What in? Tenors. Done. It was at this moment that the door opened. "Excuse me, gentlemen," glared at the intruder. She was a well-nourished girl with a kind face. She was rubbing her left leg, which appeared to be paining her. The staircases are steep at the Goose and Grasshopper. "You'll excuse me bustling in like this, gentlemen," said the barmaid, or words to that effect. "But I happened inadvertently to overhear your conversation, and I feel it my duty to act. Gentlemen, all bets are off. Miss Angelica Briscoe is already engaged to be married." You can readily conceive the effect of this announcement. Pongo biffed down into the only chair, and Barmy staggered against the wash-hand stand. "What?" said Pongo. "What?" said Barmy. The barmaid turned to Barmy. "Yes, sir, to the gentleman you were talking to in my bar the afternoon you arrived." Her initial observation had made Barmy feel as if he had been punched in the wind by 16 mothers, but at this addendum, he was able to pull himself together a bit. "Don't be an ass, my dear old barmaid," he cried. "That was Miss Briscoe's—" "But his name was Briscoe, and you told me he was at the vicarage." "Yes, sir. He spends a good deal of his time at the vicarage, being the young lady's second cousin and engaged to her since last Christmas." Barmy eyed her sternly. He was deeply moved. "Why did you not inform me of this earlier, you chump of a barmaid? With your gift for listening at doors, you must long since have become aware that this gentleman here and myself were deeply enamored of Miss Briscoe. And yet you kept these facts under your hat, causing us to waste our time and experience the utmost alarm and despondency. Do you realize, barmaid, that had you spoken sooner, my friend here would not have been subjected to the nature? It was the school treat that Mr. Briscoe was so bent on not having to go to, which he would have had to have done, Miss Angelica insisting. He had a terrible time there last year, poor gentleman. He was telling me about it. And that was why he asked me, as a particular favor, not to mention that he was engaged to Miss Briscoe, because he said that if he played his cards properly, and a little secrecy and silence were observed in the proper quarters, there was a mug staying at the inn that he thought he could get to go instead of him. It would have done you good, sir, to have seen the way his face lit up as he said it. He's a very nice gentleman, Mr. Briscoe, and we're all very fond of him. Well, I mustn't stay talking here, sir. I've got my bar to see to. And for some minutes there was silence in the room. It was Barmy who was the first to break it. After all, we still have our art, said Barmy. He crossed the room and patted Pongo on the shoulder. Of course, it's a nasty knock, old man. Pongo had raised his face from his hands and was fumbling for his cigarette case. There was a look in his eyes as if he had just awakened from. Is it? He said. You've got to look at these things from every angle. Is a girl who can deliberately allow a man to go through the horrors of a school treat worth bothering about? Barmy started. I never thought of that. Or a girl, for that matter, who could callously throw a fellow to the village mothers. Remind me sometime to tell you about a game called Is Mr. Smith at Home, where you put your head in a sack and the younger generation jab you with sticks. And don't let me forget to tell you about that mother in the puce mantle on the Bump the Bumps. There was a kid called Horace. There was a mother in a Homburg hat. The fact is, said Pongo, we have allowed ourselves to lose our idea of a mate is a mere, hey, you, to be ordered hither and thither at her will, and who will unleash the juvenile population of her native village upon him without so much as a pang of pity. In a word, a parson's daughter. If you want to know the secret of a happy and successful life, Barmy, old man, it is this. Keep away from parsons' daughters. Right away, agreed Barmy. How do you react to hiring a car and pushing off for the metropolis at once? I am all for it. And if we're to give of our best on the evening of the 11th immediately, we certainly ought. We haven't any too much time as it is. We certainly haven't. I've got an aunt who complains of rheumatism. Well, who wouldn't? My father can't meet his creditors. Does he want to? My Uncle Joe's in very low water just now. Too bad. What's he doing? Teaching swimming. Listen, Pongo, said Barmy. I've been thinking. You take the green whiskers this year. No. Yes, really, I mean it 100 times. Good old Pongo simply must have the green whiskers this year. Barmy, Pongo. They clasped hands. Tried in the furnace, their friendship had emerged strong and true. Cyril Fotheringham Phipps and Reginald Twistleton were themselves again. The inimitable P.G. Wodehouse. Oh, what fun. I think we needed a smile or two tonight. And next week I'll get started on the novel, which is by Josephine Tay. It is entitled Brat Farah. Much for being with me, my dears. Oh, we have to stay flexible. All right. And I will see you, I hope, next Wednesday at 6 o'clock for Tales and Cocktails. Good night.